Parents couldn't always shield the children from the horrors of the world, so I found ways to give back with food, candy, small joys.
Yes, this is why the original St. Nicholas paid the dowries for 3 girls so their father wouldn't have to sell them into prostitution. It's like his main thing, and nobody talks about it. Disney recently resurrected their classic existential horror franchise, The Santa Claus, with a new series on Disney Plus that takes place 16 years after the last movie and 28 years after the events of the first movie. The 2-season series, launched in 2022, is called The Santa Clauses, and it carries on the themes of the original trilogy. But before we start discussing the series, please allow me to quickly recap the main events of the first 3 movies. The Santa Claus is a Christmas movie from 1994 starring Tim Allen as a divorced dad named Scott Cavin who commits manslaughter, accidentally killing Santa Claus. As a result of legal fine print, the Santa Claus, he is forced to undergo a horrifying physical transformation into the embodiment of Santa Claus. Despite his fervent attempts to resist this magical curse, he eventually gives in and submits himself to living his life as Santa. He also becomes a good dad in the process somehow. In The Santa Claus 2, released in 2002, Scott Cavin is temporarily changed back into an average human man in order to fulfill the Santa prophecy and lure a wife to the North Pole. This is referred to as the Mrs. Claus.
Matrimony? I gotta get married.
And it works! He goes on a few dates with Juliet from Lost, whose name here is Carol. She's a school principal. Then, after a very brief courtship, he sweeps her away to the North Pole, and in front of all of the elves, informs her that he needs a wife now, or else Christmas is ruined forever and the elves will, I don't know, die or something. So of course she acquiesces, giving up her entire life and career, and they're married on the spot. Without any prior warning, he immediately transforms from Tim Allen into the overweight, aged personification of Santa Claus. In The Santa Claus 3, The Escape Clause, released in 2006, we learn that Scott and Carol have consummated their marriage, as she is now fallen pregnant. Most of the movie is them trying to trick her parents into believing they live in Canada, while Scott is too busy preparing for Christmas to spend time with his wife and in-laws. However, after a disastrous tree incident, Scott wishes he'd never become Santa. Jack Frost then tricks him into invoking the Escape Clause, where Scott is transported to an alternate present where he never became Santa. Instead, Jack Frost becomes Santa and commercializes Christmas. He turns the North Pole into a theme park and ruins everything. Scott also discovers that everyone in his alternate life is miserable and hates him. This seemingly enforces the idea that there is no world in which humanity can be happy where Scott is not Santa Claus. He must be Santa, especially if the only other option is abject misery for everyone he's ever known. So Scott decides to return to his old life and tricks Jack Frost into triggering the Escape Clause. Scott becomes Santa again, and everything goes back to the way it was. As you can see, the theme of the original trilogy is clear. You cannot escape destiny no matter how hard you try. Free will is simply an illusion. Despite any effort that Scott Cavin makes to live his own life outside of being the physical embodiment of Santa Claus, the fates seem to conspire to pull him back in. In the final movie, we learn that despite the Escape Clause, there is truly no escape for Scott Cavin. And this theme is reincorporated into the new series, showing how the shackles of destiny now bind Scott's entire family. We watch Scott, Carol, and their 2 children struggle in vain to have some measure of control over their own lives. So let's look at the series in full, and we'll discuss some specifics that show how it exemplifies these themes. But the most interesting thing about this show is that it explains the real reason that Scott Cavin became Santa Claus. And it's not what you think. Spoilers for the first 2 seasons of The Santa Clauses, or this may be the only 2 seasons of The Santa Clauses, or the show might come back next year, or in like 6 years, or in 16 years. Part 1! The ho-ho hopelessness of destiny and the futility of choice. I just need you to know that the very first episode of this series is titled Good to Ho. The first season of The Santa Clauses shows us a world where Christmas spirit has diminished and Scott Cavin no longer feels the same joy in his Santa work that he used to. The situation overall is bleak.
What's the point of this anymore?
Sir, you love these confabs.
I used to love it.
The Santa list is getting shorter and shorter because fewer children are believing in Santa, which consequently means that they are only delivering presents to children who are believers, which doesn't really seem reflective of the true meaning of Christmas and the spirit of giving, but okay. We also see that Scott's wife Carol has been having identity issues as Mrs. Claus. No surprise, since she literally just abandoned her entire life to move to the North Pole just to bear his children with no other clear expectations for her role or anything to do with her time.
Wasn't it weird when you married Santa and you had to move all the way up to the pole and give up your old life, Mrs. Claus?
Weirder than you can possibly imagine.
Her whole deal is that she's taken on the mantle of Mrs. Claus, except like still hot. However, that mantle means nothing because Mrs. Claus is just a shell of a person. She has no purpose. And this weighs on Carol.
This is exactly how I'm perceived. Dumpy. Void of all personality and appeal, and somehow humorless while still providing comic relief.
Mrs. Claus as a figure doesn't even have a first name.
Mrs. Claus doesn't have a first name. I don't have a first name.
It's Carol.
Carol was my before name.
Scott's kids are also dealing with their burgeoning adolescence in an environment where they are the only 2 human children.
Not crazy. I'm just lonely sometimes.
Literally, the only other humans are their parents. They have no classmates, no peers, no friends, no romantic interests, no bullies, no rivals. It's just them. And it's made them kind of weird. Sandra spends a lot of her time talking to animals.
This furry friends things, getting out of hand.
Cal, in particular, the elder of the 2 children who we saw born in the Santa Claus 3, seems to yearn for a life in the real world. Throughout the season, we see him have this virtual reality headset that he loves. Later, we discover that the virtual reality that he's been escaping to is a place where he can mow the lawn and, like, go to the post office.
What is this?
Topeka, Kansas. I just finished mowing the lawn and now I'm going to the post office.
He wants to have mundane human experiences.
Meet a crossing guard, use those hand-drying things in public bathrooms,
Like a lot.
be a part of a sea boarding group.
Maybe a little too much. Like I said, these kids are weird. It's sort of like the isolation of some homeschooled kids, but times 1,000.
We did a study on human kids raised here, and the conclusion is that they turn out very weird.
Well, how many kids have been raised here?
Including Cal and Sandra?
Yeah.
2.
So Scott takes a good look at his life, at his family's lives, and he makes a decision.
After careful consideration and talk with my family, I, Santa Claus, have decided to retire.
He's 65 years old. It's perfectly reasonable. We should all be so lucky as to retire at 65. As is the tradition in this franchise, the elves present a new relevant legal clause. The successus clause. Scott is allowed to retire upon 2 conditions. 1, when he has completed his mission, and 2, when he has found a proper successor.
The successes clause states that you may step down once you've effectively completed your mission and chosen a proper successor.
Great! Sounds like this'll work out then. After a brief search and a round of interviews, Scott selects Simon, a businessman who runs an e-commerce company. Simon is a widower, and he has an adorable young daughter named Grace.
These pools are marshmallows.
No, don't eat that. We might get charged for it.
His love for his daughter is what makes Scott believe that Simon will be a good pick.
My number one goal right now is just to try to make her happy.
After all, Scott was a rather boorish man who was too focused on himself and his work to be a good dad. But even still, he loved his son Charlie and eventually figured out how to do right by him. Kind of, because he did lose custody of his son when he began involuntarily changing into Santa Claus. But becoming Santa ultimately helped him figure out how to be more emotionally present for his son Charlie and really make their time together count. Although it did make him even more physically distant, because Scott did move up to the North Pole full time while Charlie stayed in the real world. Charlie is Scott's first pick as a successor, but he says, no thank you. He's actually the one to point out to Scott how the North Pole is a terrible place for raising children.
It's the North Pole. It's not the best place to raise kids.
Cal, is Sandra okay?
Are they, though? You do know that I've spent time with them, right?
Yeah, he knows his half-siblings are just like a little off. So Scott turns over the Santa coat to Simon, the passing of the legacy and the Santa powers. Remember Bernard's words from the first movie?
You put on the suit, you're the big guy.
But despite Scott making his choice, the coat resists Simon.
Oh, it's heavier than I thought.
Okay.
Sorry.
Hey, whoa, geez.
Slippery little sucker. Thanks, honey. Stay there.
After the elves declare their love for Satan, Scott, Carol, Cal, and Sandra are teleported to their new home in Chicago. The kids find out, presumably for the first time, that their dad looks like Tim Allen.
Guess who this random man is?
A guy named Ron?
Ron?
No.
Carol is immediately back in her element. She's been gone like 20 years, but her old colleagues still remember her. I doubt she's been able to call or write or visit in all of that time, considering she's been under a magical Christmas curse that stripped her of her identity. So this is wild to me.
My goodness, you guys! Oh, it's been forever.
Mom is like the dad of this place.
The school district wants to give her a job?
So the district is opening a new charter school, and they want me to be in charge of it.
I mean, she hasn't worked in education for over 20 years, but from what my teacher friends tell me, that tracks. Schools are pretty desperate. They'll just be like, oh, you've been a bush pilot in Alaska or whatever for the past few decades and haven't so much as seen a child in years? You're hired. Cal falls for the first human girl he's ever interacted with in his entire life who's not a blood relative, so good for him. Sandra becomes a horse girl and she makes horse girl friends.
We sort of have this riding club. You wouldn't want to join us, would you?
It's taking Scott a little bit longer to adjust, but he doesn't really seem unhappy. He just seems a little bit lost, a little bit aimless. But I imagine when you've been in one job in an isolated area for decades, it's going to take you more than 7 months to adjust to something new. I honestly think this happens to a lot of people when they retire. But he's happy that his family is happy. and his family is so happy. However, things back at the North Pole are not great.
My beautiful, forever young elves. Who wants to give me some of your blood?
I'm just kidding, come on!
Simon has decided to institute Christmas every day using delivery drones, and it's taking the proverbial magic out of Christmas. And also the literal magic. And on top of that, the Santa coat has fully rejected Simon and gone into hiding, so Simon doesn't even possess the Santa powers. Noel the elf goes off to find Scott to tell him what's happening, and Scott says that Simon is free to be whatever kind of Santa he wants to be.
Simon deserves the right to be the Santa of his choosing, right? Just like I deserve the right to be the dad I was meant to be.
But here's the thing. The successus clause said that Scott could retire when he's completed his mission and found a proper successor. But who decides that his mission is complete? Who decides the worthiness of his successor? Because it turns out it's not Scott. Because Scott chose. He made his decision to stop being Santa. He picked Simon, but it's ultimately not up to him. The worthiness of his successor can only be determined by forces outside of Scott's control. And if they never deem anyone worthy, then Scott can never leave. With the decline in Christmas magic, elves basically start dying. This seems to be the usual consequence of a world where Scott Calvin isn't Santa. People suffer.
I don't feel too good.
I don't feel so good, Mr. Stark. So our old friend Bernard appears, ravaged by age and time. And we'll talk a little bit more about Bernard later. But he leads Scott into the Yule-verse to meet the Santas who came before. And we learn something very important. Christmas magic is weird and confusing. Scott is actually the first human Santa.
Am I the first human Santa?
The other Santas didn't even have names. The 17th one is just called 17.
I was the 17th Santa, so most just call me 17.
He's like 11 in Stranger Things.
Parents couldn't always shield the children from the horrors of the world, so I found ways to give back with food, candy, small joys.
Yes, this is why the original St. Nicholas paid the dowries for 3 girls so their father wouldn't have to sell them into prostitution. It's like his main thing, and nobody talks about it. St. Nicholas is the patron saint of prostitutes, and it's never in any of the Christmas movies.
And from that magic emanated the world of claws and elves, ethereal beings who carried on the mission.
Why are there even multiple Santas then? Why not just one? Does Christmas magic just keep spontaneously generating new Santas every few decades? Are they just randomly spawning into existence? We don't know. So up until now, Scott has believed that him becoming Santa was just a coincidence, that it was a random accident. He is only now realizing that he has been the puppet of forces much more powerful than him.
But I'm here because of an accident. I saw you slip off the roof. You fell.
You think someone yelling, "Hey," really made me slip and fall?
This is when we discover that the Santa who fell off of Scott's roof specifically chose Scott as his successor.
Each Santa was chosen to meet the challenges of their time. Technology was becoming the new magic. I thought only a human could meet the new challenges.
So let me get this straight. Scott was chosen for this without any knowledge or awareness, but instead of being asked, they tricked him via staged manslaughter and legal fine print. He was physically transformed against his will, causing him to lose custody of his son and experience great emotional distress. And now when he chooses to leave for the good of his family, he's told no and pulled right back in.
You chose the wrong replacement because you weren't supposed to step down yet.
The fact that there are actions that Scott is supposed to take that go against his own wishes, and if he does not take those actions, there will be lasting and severe consequences, really sounds like Scott does not have free will. Sure, in general, all actions have consequences. I put a magic hat on a snowman and he comes to life. Consequence. I try to slide down a chimney and get stuck and the smell of my rotting corpse disturbs a child. Consequence based on a 1987 novelty song. But this is not cause and effect. This is predestination. These rules were created specifically for Scott, guiding his life and his choices under the guise of history and tradition.
Clauses were created to guide you. The Santa Claus, the Mrs. Claus, all of them.
Really, the clauses were just made up to get Scott to do what these inhuman entities wanted him to do. To reiterate, these other Santa Clauses were ethereal beings. Scott Cavin is the first human Santa.
Am I ethereal?
Nope. You are a regular human man with many, many faults.
And there's a reason for this. And we'll talk more about that later. Now the Santas show Scott that the elves are dying because, of course, when Scott Cavin is not Santa, people suffer.
The elves are disappearing. Why didn't you lead with that?
Scott ultimately realizes that he does have to go back to the North Pole. He initially tried to say no, but it took all of this interdimensional Yuleverse time-bending nonsense to convince him.
Now, you may all have picked him for the job, but Scott chose to be Santa.
No, he didn't. We have seen time and time again that while Scott has accepted his lot in life, he never chose it. You know what he did choose? To leave. And you won't let him. So Scott goes back to tell his family, hey, I know you were happy here in Chicago, but we have to go back to the North Pole. And they are not pleased by this decree.
We have a life now, and the kids live it here, and I finally have a name, and it's Principal Carol.
I love it here too.
Even Scott loves being back in Chicago. And then Carol and the kids learned that they were the first human family at the North Pole.
We were specifically chosen for this time. Well, that changes everything. We have to go back.
Carol understands the burden of destiny. Plus, then Scott tells them that the elves are blinking out of existence. And considering that elves were like the only people that they knew for the past 30-ish years, then they definitely have to go back.
Elves are disappearing? You should have led with that. No, we're part of this. We're going.
And Scott leaves without them?
I think he left us.
I'm gonna kill him.
Oh, well, no, Mom, you can't kill Santa, because then you'd become Santa. And how would that work?
There's also no indication that any Mrs. Claus existed before Carol.
So I was the first Mrs. Claus.
I didn't ask.
Of course you didn't.
Which makes sense if Scott is the first human Santa. Like, why does an ethereal being need a wife? But it's also another clue as to the big mystery of why this is all happening. And we'll get to that later. It's in section 4, but we'll get to it. We gotta build up to this. By the way, just as an aside, I assumed that the Santa coat could fly, that it was just fluttering around like a plastic bag on the breeze. No, this is how the coat travels. Crawling on the ground like a dying sloth. Also not plot relevant, but this show has multiple Lost references.
We're gonna have to come up with that backstory because it's gonna be too many questions. So I don't know about Lost on an island.
Just begs more questions.
All right,
You
all right,
trust me.
guys.
What, the smoke monster?
Where have I seen this before?
Since the coat has rejected Simon, rather than let Scott have the coat back and resume control of Christmas, Simon wants to burn it. But then Grace reminds Simon of the spirit of Christmas or whatever, and he gives the coat back to Scott. At the end, Scott blames himself for the global lessening of Christmas spirit because he didn't step up when things got hard.
I became aware that the world is becoming more challenging, and instead of stepping up, I stepped down. How do you expect other people to hold on to the Christmas spirit when I let it go myself?
He is 65 years old. Is this man not allowed to retire? Like, he's human. They picked him because he was human. Humans get old. The love of the Cavin/Claus family brings all the dead elves back to life. I thought that they disappeared because of the lessening of Christmas spirit all around the world, but no, I guess it was just all dependent on the love of this one family. One of the elves is not above emotional manipulation and makes Sandra promise that she will never leave ever again.
Sandra, you can hang me on your bedroom wall for all I care. Just promise me you'll never leave again.
I mean, yeah, if a family of 4 leaving my hometown meant that I and all of my loved ones would Thanos snap out of existence, I too would be like, please don't leave, I want to live. Scott puts on the coat and transforms back into Santa, and now the entire Cavin/Claus family comes along on Santa's Christmas sleigh ride. Cal arranges for everyone to receive magical snow globes for Christmas. I guess the snow globes show your favorite Christmas memory. Turns out Sandra can literally talk to animals, and we find out the reindeer's real names.
Actually, Dad, they prefer to be called Chopper, Razor, the Hoofster, Atomic, Hotshot, Pretty Boy, Airbender, and Steve.
I wouldn't have guessed. Scott sends Cal down a specific chimney that turns out to belong to Cal's girlfriend who dumped him when he tried to tell her that his dad was Santa and he had to go back to the North Pole.
Cal?
Oh, not Cal. Just a confused old man looking for his home.
But Christmas is a success. True, they handed out legitimate magical objects to a bunch of people, but that's next season's problem. Except, not really. You hear one guy talk about it like twice, and then everyone just kind of forgets. It's interesting to me that the closing song for this season is You Can't Always Get What You Want by the Rolling Stones. Scott and his family can't get what they want, but apparently this is what the world needs. The second season is a little bit less about some of this interpersonal drama and more about an evil past Santa who's accidentally released from a magical nutcracker who plots to take over the North Pole.
We are going to take back the North Pole, and when we end this weak Santa, the whole world will pay!
The evil Santa is named Magnus Antis, and they call him the Mad Santa. He's a very weird character, but I found him very entertaining and interesting to watch.
My stepmother was to boil me, so her son inherits the clock.
And a happy new year.
That is not how it ends. I was the first Santa to say, ho, 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 and they're still using it today.
He has a sidekick gnome named Olga who just absolutely steals the show with all of her angry, violent outbursts.
Oh, no, she's a gnome.
Gnome? Since when does Santa Claus have gnomes? I invested all this money in elf ears.
Elves.
She's adorable.
No.
Yeah.
She will bite you.
Yeah, I see that.
We're no closer to smiting our enemies than we were when we awoke in the sad purgatory.
Ultimately, at the end of the season, Scott is still the one true Santa, and Magnus Antis goes to work as an entertainer at a Santa theme park. And Olga stays at the North Pole to make like shoehorns or something.
A weapon.
I think it's a shoehorn. Consider this a parting gift.
There are a few specific elements from the second season that play into the overall themes of the series, but I will discuss those separately in the next couple of sections. Part 2, Stocking-Holm Syndrome, Cause and Effect. Did Scott Cavin really choose to be Santa? The question has come up repeatedly, but I want to address it in detail.
I was thinking actually that I never wanted to be Santa Claus, which is why it was the most awesome thing that's ever happened to me.
But he never really chose it. We saw Scott resist so hard. He tried to resist the Santa transformation in the beginning. And he tells Sandra that he really accepted it when he got to see himself through Charlie's eyes.
I started seeing it through Charlie's eyes, and it changed me for the better.
But more than physically, he begins changing mentally. He finds himself starting to crave sweets, and he realizes that he can just look at people and know their name and know what they want for Christmas.
Annie, nice.
Beep.
Johnny, naughty. Gary, nice.
This is happening to him, and he can't stop it. In the movie, he's basically given 1 year to get his affairs in order and say goodbye to his old life, like he's dying, before he officially begins his role as Santa.
You have 11 months to get your affairs in order, and you're due back here Thanksgiving.
And when the subsequent Christmas rolls around, we see that Scott has just given in to this new life. Perhaps in the end, he saw himself through Charlie's eyes and accepted it in that moment. His fate of becoming the human vessel of Christmas magic. But he clearly expresses his regrets in the third movie. Like Jack Frost barely had to prompt him.
So are there times when you wonder if this was even
Worth it? More than you know.
Tonight's one of these times, huh?
Wish I'd never put that red coat on. I wish I'd never become Santa.
Sure, he came around in the end after seeing the weird mess that Jack Frost made out of Christmas, and sure, he says that he loves being Santa.
I love being Santa Claus, and I love you.
I love you too. Have you been drinking cocoa?
No.
But did he love being Santa? Or does he just love having a purpose in life and having like a family and people around who care about him versus the Ebenezer Scrooge existence he was shown in his alternate life? Plus, in this series, we see Scott say that he loves living in Chicago.
I love it here too, but as I told you guys, I spent some time in this realm, the Yuleverse.
And now we learned that this whole situation wasn't even an accident. A supernatural being picked Scott. There was a plan. The fact that his family loves their new lives in Chicago so much shows that they definitely didn't choose the isolation and the limited opportunities of the North Pole. Carol, in particular, is immediately excited by the prospect of living a life outside of Mrs. Claus.
I love it here. I really do. But sometimes I think that it might be nice to try something new.
Are you packing?
No, I'm just, seeing if I have any of my pre-Mrs. Claus clothes in here.
You also get a sense that she actually did resent having to just fully give up her career.
I like it. I'm an Alaskan bush pilot. We already talked about it. It's a great idea.
Yeah, I'm the bush pilot. I didn't want everyone at work to think that I left this great job to be the nameless, faceless woman behind a larger-than-life man.
And of course, the fact that she was catfished by Santa Claus.
Is this going to become a thing?
No, you asking me to marry you and then gaining 200 pounds was a thing. This is much bigger.
This echoes some of the sentiments from the third movie regarding Carol's isolation from her family, just kind of stuck with this workaholic husband.
Well, maybe you just don't understand the pressure I'm under.
Well, maybe it's not as bad as being ripped away from your family and told you can't see them anymore.
Dad, maybe we shouldn't have come.
Maybe you're right. Maybe you shouldn't have come.
Maybe I should never have come either.
This issue isn't really resolved at the end of that movie, by the way. Scott just kind of like goes on his alternate life journey, comes back, apologizes, and it's fine now. The whole narrative about Mrs. Claus not really having a purpose is kind of a running gag / plot line through both seasons. In the first season, it's really more of a gag.
Why does Mrs. Claus have to look like a time-worn, overstuffed armchair?
She doesn't know what she's doing as Mrs. Claus, and in turn, the show doesn't really know what to do with her. Like, she gets a fight scene at one point.
They call me Mrs. Claus!
And then in the second season, to try and find a purpose, she decides to take over ELFS, the Elf Security Force. But she doesn't really do much with it, though. We see her fly with a jetpack, so I guess that's something. The elves don't really have much of a say in their circumstances either. And we will take a more in-depth look at the elves and their various characteristics in the next section. But first, it's time for the Krampus interlude! When Scott goes into the Yuleverse in season 1, we meet Krampus.
Where is the mule smell coming from? Very good. Krampus, listen, how do I get back to Chicago? The door. Okay, great.
However, I take very strong issue with this appearance.
Taking kids' toys, always good.
Krampus doesn't steal presents, he steals children. How dare you? He beats the bad children with birch sticks and then drags them off to hell to be eaten, as per the holiday tradition. Just look at these vintage Christmas cards. They'll tell you everything you need to know. I can also assume that he's very popular with the ladies. Part 3. Naughty or nice? Nature versus nurture. The elves who live at the North Pole love working. They love Christmas, and they love making toys.
We're gonna work hard, and we're gonna play hard.
They don't want to take vacations. Vacations are like a punishment to them.
Which means you've all earned a huge vacation. Or we could go down to the shop and start making toys.
Immediately after Christmas, they're excited to start preparing for the next Christmas.
He doesn't have time. We're already behind schedule, and it's only 300 days till Christmas.
Oh, you're serious?
They're sort of like the house elves in Harry Potter. Like, no, they're not slaves. They like working. They have no other hobbies or inner thoughts. This is their thing. Be that as it may, we do see several times where the elves wish that they could be in charge of their own circumstances or their own fates or their own lives, but are denied the opportunity. For example, Cribble Crabble. We learn that there is kind of an elf rumspringa called Cribble Crabble, where the elves are sent to go spend a year in the real world, and at the end of the year, they can either choose to return to the North Pole, or they can stay in the real world. But here's the thing. You know what the consequence is for Amish youth who go on Rumspringa and decide to stay in the outside world? They're shunned. At that point, they're not allowed to go home anymore. And they don't mention that the elves are explicitly shunned, but apparently the elves who do decide to leave after Cribble Crabble are never heard from again.
Curtis went to Cribble Crabble, never came back.
We meet one. Bernard!
Said, I haven't seen you since you disappeared from the North Pole to the elf Rumspringa. Cribble Crabble. Yeah, whatever, you never came back.
Now, of course, the choice to come up with some narrative device surrounding Bernard is purely to justify bringing back the original actor, but explaining how he's old now. It's more of a logistical decision than a storytelling choice.
Well, I met someone, a human, so I made the jump and gave up eternal youth as an elf, and now I've got this thing, and it won't go away no matter how many burpees I do.
But this highlights another consequence of choosing to leave the North Pole. Death! Aging and death. Elves can live for hundreds, if not thousands of years, but the second they decide to leave the North Pole, they begin physically decaying. And now, where they might have had 600 years left to live, they've only got 60. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less, but they are growing older and more frail with each passing day. What kind of a choice is that? I guess it's the same kind of choice that's offered to Scott Cavin. Sure, you can choose not to be Santa, but if you do, people are going to suffer, and it's all going to be your fault. I've been filming for a while, and the sun is going down, and you can see where, like, the natural sunlight is now falling only on the hoe on my shirt and the wig. And as we see, Bernard still isn't free of the demands of Christmas. When he is summoned, he must still appear and take Scott into the Yuleverse. The elves are also forced to go on Cribble Crabble. They can't choose not to go. And we see this in the second season with Betty, the head elf, who does not want to go on Cribble Crabble, but they make her. She tries to run, but they literally chase her down. The elves also can't choose their Santa. When the Ethereals decided that the next Santa would be human, Bernard was against it.
I was against this whole Scott experiment from the very beginning.
But Bernard had no say in the matter. We also see that the elves are somewhat against the idea of Cal as Santa's successor.
Cal has neither the physical, mental, or emotional acumen for the job. When he ties his shoelaces, he still says over, under, around, and through, meet Mr. Bunny, pull him through.
I don't need to. I just like it.
However, their concerns are brushed aside. When Mad Santa reigned over the North Pole, he was terrorizing the elves and wanted to punish all of the world's children. The elves wanted to overthrow him, but they never would have been able to if La Befana had not intervened. The Ethereals said that no ethereal could interfere in another one's business, so she sacrificed her status as an ethereal being in order to overthrow the Mad Santa and turn him into a nutcracker. It's also mentioned that the elves can't be Santa.
You know who would be a great Santa? You.
Elves can't be Santa.
Even though Betty is a highly competent leader.
More weird rules. This place would crumble without you.
I'm just happy to serve.
So the elves are, by nature, workaholics and docile servants. But we also hear a lot about how the elves hate gnomes.
Elves don't lie. What do you take us for, gnomes?
You lie like a gnome.
Just a lot of negative stereotypes about gnomes. Then we meet the gnomes, and guess what? They're terrible.
Take them away, roughly! Don't listen to the gnomes, Santa! Their tongues are as untrustworthy as their unnaturally round ears!
In the same way that the elves have this natural predilection towards sugar and toy making, the gnomes seem hardwired to be mean and violent. We do learn that the gnomes perhaps desire to be good and make toys, but they have some natural predilection towards only being able to make useful objects.
Have you ever even tried to make a toy?
Of course. Every gnome for centuries has. But each time we do, instead of building something just for fun, we end up making something useful.
In the end, both the elves and the gnomes acknowledge that they are basically slaves to the whims of these powerful men.
It doesn't make sense that we're enemies. We're both formidable beings in positions of power, yet we're still beholden to the whims of doofuses.
By the way, I love Olga the Gnome. I think this is just the performance of a lifetime. The actress was born in Russia and was probably only like 14 years old here, but she is great. Just all of her lines are delivered by yelling.
I will kill all of you! He's the guy. His name is Magnus Santa. I'm no elf, I'm a gnome.
Cool. Gnomes.
I'm not here to make friends.
Olga deserves every single second of screen time. Both Olga and Betty are excellent characters. Their young actresses do such a good job, and the characters themselves are foils for each other. They even get a fight scene.
Athena.
Oh, Galacalus.
Part 4. You better watch out. The ultimate goal. The concept of nature versus nurture, as exhibited by elves and gnomes, ties in to the real underlying purpose of every single thing that has happened in the Santa Claus franchise. Why the Santa Claus? Why Scott Cavin? Why pick a human man and make him Santa? Why make him find a wife so quickly? Why make their family live at the North Pole? Because the powers that be wanted to breed the perfect Santa. The other Santas were ethereal beings. Scott was the first human Santa, and using a sequence of legal clauses, the ethereals gave this human man Santa magic and forced him to quickly find a bride to produce an heir that would be conceived, born, and raised in the environment of North Pole magic. This way, his children would inherit the magic, and the passing of the Santa torch would be more set in stone.
I thought a human Santa could raise his family in the North Pole, and perhaps those kids would inherit the magic of the North, making the passing of the torch less up to the whims of a bunch of pompous ethereals.
Remember, Scott already had a son, and you may think that Charlie escaped his fate of being the next Santa by saying no, but that's because it wasn't his fate. And the kids do develop powers. The plan worked. We see that Cal developed Santa magic without the Santa coat.
We do have powers.
I knew it. I knew it. We'll use your powers. Can you get us out of here?
No, but Sandra can speak to animals, and I can see holes in the sky.
Fun?
In the first season, Cal expresses that becoming Santa is literally a nightmare for him.
I think about it too when I have dreams where I'm Santa.
You have dreams that you're Santa?
Yeah. Super vivid dreams, yeah.
You're talking about your dreams of being Santa?
No. I never said they were good dreams.
Which is why Scott picked Simon in the first place. But in the second season, Cal begins training with his dad to potentially be the next Santa. However, his heart's not really in it. He just wants to go back to Chicago and hang out with his girlfriend and do things like go to prom.
You even want to be Santa?
Why wouldn't I? Riley likes how I look in the vest. If I ever succeed, it'll make Dad so happy.
So you're doing it for everyone but yourself.
Sandra also has powers. She can talk to animals, and she has witch magic like La Befana. But ultimately, she just seems to be an afterthought. Cal is the one with the Santa magic. Sandra isn't even considered as a potential candidate. This is also why Mrs. Claus has no purpose. Like the wives of many medieval kings, her only function was to produce an heir. And that's it. At the end of the second season, Scott tries to give Cal a choice. He wants Cal to be able to live the human life that he so desperately desires, so that one day he can choose to be Santa if that's what he ultimately wants.
Because I know a young man that needs to spend some time in the real world, experiencing the best part of life so that he can make an informed decision should he decide to become the next Santa Claus.
But this remains to be seen, because the whole premise of this series is that Scott wants to retire, but he can't until his mission is complete and he's picked a successor who is deemed worthy by magical forces that are outside of his control. And even though some of the elves may think that Cal isn't the right pick, it doesn't matter. He's already developed Santa magic. In fact, when Magnus Antis turns Cal into a nutcracker, he says that Cal has more Santa magic than he thought.
Are you all right?
I'm drained. Yet more Santa magic than I had expected.
I theorize that the only successor the magical forces will deem worthy is the one that they bred specifically for this purpose. Only when Cal dons the Santa suit will Scott Calvin's mission be complete and he will finally be free. Even Scott believes that this is Cal's ultimate purpose.
I think he's destined to be Santa Claus, that's it.
Fate has already chosen Cal. His path is laid out before him. Perhaps he can delay the inevitable for some time, maybe years even. But as the Santa Claus has shown us, again and again, you can't fight destiny. You know, Cal makes a very good point about Memorial Day in America.
Parties, barbecues, games, and fun? What are we memorialing?
Fallen soldiers.
What? Why are we having a picnic?
Also, in the very first episode, we're introduced to Simon as a businessman running an e-commerce company, and he is walking through a presentation about his company's share of the Christmas market, and we see a pie chart that says that 17% of the market belongs to other. And nobody on his team knows what other is. We can infer that it's Santa, but you guys made this presentation. You had to get that data from somewhere. Also, it's interesting that Santa only accounts for 17% of the Christmas market. Scott and his family have sacrificed their entire lives for this, and it's only 17%. I have to tell you, this wig sheds more than any other wig I've ever had, but I love it so much. I do a volunteer thing every year with children where I dress up as a Christmas elf. I know that seems very not on brand for me. What, Christina? You volunteer with children? Yeah, I know. It's just once a year. Don't worry about it. But I dress as a Christmas elf and help Santa hand out presents. And I kind of wonder if I should add this wig to my costume or if it's a little too much.